So for the last couple weeks, we've been asking this question: is it possible for two people to stay in love, happy together forever? And we all hope so, don't we? And that is the problem. We all hope so, and hope is not a strategy. You can hope all you want to hope, but if you keep doing what everybody else is doing, you're going to end up where everybody else ends up. If you keep doing the thing you've always done, you're going to keep getting the results you've always gotten. So we can hope all we want to hope, but hope is actually not strong enough to change anything. We need something more than hope. What we've talked about the last couple of weeks is we need a plan. And the reason we need a plan is because love isn't a noun, love is a verb. Let me explain what I mean by that. Love isn't a noun, it's not a thing that just happens to you or doesn't happen to you. And most of us think of it this way. Well, either it happened or it didn't happen. Either we got it or we didn't get it. But love's not a noun, it's not a thing that you fall into, fall out of, it happens, it doesn't happen. Love is a verb, and by that I mean love is a choice. Love is an action. Love is something you do. You and I get to choose, and this should be good news for us all. We actually get to choose whether or not we're going to love. We get to choose whether or not we're going to engage in the behaviors necessary to stay in love, happy together forever. And this is why you need more than hope. This is why you need a plan. You need a plan of action that's going to help you become the kind of person that has the capacity and the character to stay in love, happy together forever. And as we've looked over the last couple of weeks, we've seen that the Apostle Paul gives us a plan. It's in maybe his most famous writing in 1 Corinthians 13. We spent the last 2 weeks going through that. And Paul explained to all of us, well, here's what the plan looks like. Here's what this kind of love looks like. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love honors one another. Love is humble. Love is selfless. Love believes the best in others. Love, doesn't lose its temper and lose its, easily get angered. That love keeps no record of wrongs. He gave us this list of here's exactly what the kind of love looks like that helps you stay in love, happy together forever, which is helpful, except when you look at the list, you think, well, this is overwhelming. Where do I even start? This is overwhelming. I'm not sure I'm good at most of these. And so last week I ended by making you a promise. And the promise was I was going to give you a cheat code, okay? So when you look at the list and you read through 1 Corinthians 13 and you see all of these behaviors you're supposed to have and you think, there is no way I'll ever be good at all of that. Well, there's a cheat code. There's a shortcut, if you will. There's something that you can do that if you learn how to practice this, it will put you on the path to all the other things. And so today, for a few minutes, I want to explain to you what this one thing is that really could potentially change everything for you in terms of your relationships. But before I tell you what the one thing is, and we'll get to that eventually, before I tell you what the one thing is, I need to warn you that you're not going to want to do the one thing I'm about to tell you. And the reason I say that is because I've never met anybody, myself included, who has come face to face with this and not resisted it to some extent. This one thing creates some tension in all of us. Everybody deals with it, but I think, in my experience, that those of us who are men probably resist this more than the ladies do. And I want to explain to you why, and I'm not trying to pick on you here. I just know because it's true for me, and a lot of the men I've talked to, it's true for them. I just think it's common for all of us that we tend to resist this. And sitting in your seat, I totally understand why. So I thought, you know what? Let me just go ahead and address it up front before we talk about the thing. So I made a list of 4 things, 4 reasons why I think we men tend to resist this. And I want to put it on your radar so when you start to resist it, you go, oh, so that's that thing Matt said was going to happen, okay? And then you'll at least be aware of why you're fighting against it or why you're feeling the tension. Part of the reason you're not going to want to do, guys, what we're going to talk about today is because we don't like to be wrong. As men, we hate being wrong, don't we? We don't want to have to admit we're wrong. We don't want the people that we love the most, especially our wife or our girlfriend or fiance, we don't want them to see us wrong. We don't like to be wrong at all. Not only that, but we don't like to be told what to do. Everybody already knows that. I probably don't even have to say anything there, right? I'm the same way. I don't like to be told what to do. You don't like to be told what to do. And this is what makes it even worse. We don't want another man telling us how to run our relationship. We definitely don't want another man telling us what to do when it comes to our romantic relationships. And that is my problem today because here I stand getting ready to tell you what to do in your relationship, and I get it, okay? So if you find yourself going, Matt doesn't know what he's talking about, and I can't, I'm going to ignore all that, and that's ridiculous. I get it because, again, I'm with you. This is going to be hard for some of you to believe, but I was a man before I was a pastor. You'll have to think about that for a minute, but it's true. I was a man before I was a pastor. So I'm like you, okay? I'm just being honest. I'm like you. When I sit where you're sitting and I hear somebody on stage telling me what I should do in my marriage relationship, I am just like you. I sit there and I think, what do they know? That's terrible advice. You know, I got this figured out. I don't need any help. I do the exact same thing. I don't like somebody telling me how to run my relationship, so I get it. If you feel that way, I think that's all of us, all right? And then the fourth reason is because we want our wives to think all the great ideas are our ideas. Isn't that true? There's nothing worse than when my wife has listened to a podcast, read a book, or gone and heard somebody speak, and she comes home and she says, hey, I got this great idea. I think it would make our marriage better if. And I'm like, where'd that come from? Well, I heard so-and-so say. And I'm like, oh, no, that's not a good idea. I don't even care what the idea is. I'm like, that's not a good idea. Why? Because it wasn't my idea. So, of course, it's not a good idea. Now, you forget that idea, and I'll come back and reintroduce it in a few weeks, and then it's a great idea. But it's not going to be a great idea unless it's mine. Guys, you get it, right? We just want our wives to think, our girlfriends to think all the great ideas are our ideas. That's part of, you ladies are going, what is wrong with you guys? I don't know. The male ego is strange, isn't it? It's just strange. But it's the way we work. So, because of all of these reasons, I'm fighting an uphill battle with all of you guys. And I just want you to know, I get that. I'm just like you. But when you start resisting what we're about to talk about, just remember that. When you find yourself in a situation this week where you need to practice what we're about to talk about, and you find yourself going, I don't want to practice that. And ladies, you find yourself going, why is he not doing what he just heard? This is why he's not doing it. So ladies, I'm really telling you this so you'll cut him a little slack, all right? Because our ego is just so big, it's hard. It's going to take a little while. It's going to take a little while to figure this out and fight through the resistance. Now, just for fun, merely just for fun, as I was putting this list together, I thought, I wonder what the women will think as I read this list off. And I think I know, and this is a dangerous thing, okay? But I think I know. So ladies, you can tell me if I'm right or not. But I think as I was reading through that, you were probably thinking this. Well, you're wrong most of the time. So why do you never want to be wrong? Because it seems like you're wrong all the time. You're really good at being wrong. Not only that, but you need somebody to tell you what to do because you're acting like you don't have a clue. This is what my wife would think. This is what she has said to me at times. She doesn't just think it. It's like, I think you need some help because you're not sure. Not only that, you wouldn't need another man to tell you how to run your relationship if you just listen to your woman. So true, isn't it? So true. But don't throw elbows. Y'all laughed way too hard at that. And now the male ego is already spiked up now, okay? And then finally, your greatest ideas were our ideas that we let you think were your ideas. Ladies, we know you do that. Remember that old movie Inception? My wife does that to me all the time. I think she plants the idea in there, and then I come around and go, I got an idea. And she's like, really? You're so smart. She just plays along to my ego. So anyway, all of that to say, there is an idea, there is a practice that you can do. And it is like a cheat code. And it will make all the difference in the world. But you will find yourself resisting it, and you won't even know for sure why you resist it. So when you begin to feel that tension, I just want you to pause and go, oh, Matt warned me about this. This is that thing that we all deal with, and I need to figure out how to work through the tension. So I'm going to tell you what the thing is that you need to do at the end. First, I want to set a little context, and I want to introduce to you an idea that some of you may have heard before, but for many of you, this will be a brand new idea. It's something that's not talked about a lot. It's this concept or this idea of mutual submission. Mutual submission. Let me define mutual submission to you. Mutual submission is when there are two people in a relationship and they each have the attitude, I want to put the interests, the needs, the desires, and the wants of the other person before my own. That's mutual submission. When you have two people in a relationship and they both, on a consistent basis, not perfectly because nobody's perfect, but on a consistent basis, choose to defer to the other person. It looks like this. Where do you want to eat? No, where do you want to eat? No, I'll go where you want to. No, let's go where you want to. And it's annoying because you can't decide where to eat, but it's kind of nice because both of you want to do what the other one wants to do. It's when you find yourself in a situation going, well, you tell me how you want to handle it. No, you tell me how you want to handle it. No, we'll handle it your way. No, we'll handle it your way. Hey, why don't we spend more time with your family this Christmas? No, why don't we spend more time with your family this Christmas? That never happens, does it? That's what mutual submission looks like, okay? And when you have two people who can, again, not perfectly, but consistently defer to the other person, what you have just experienced is mutual submission. And I would debate and I would argue And I would suggest that mutual submission is the most powerful relationship principle on the planet. That is not an overstatement. Mutual submission is the most powerful relationship principle on the planet. When two people learn how to practice this with each other, when two people are always treating the other person as if they're the most important person in the room, extraordinary things happen in the relationship. When you have two people who practice mutual submission, it is impossible for them not to stay in love, happy together forever. Now, do you know who introduced the idea of mutual submission into the world? Jesus. You can research this on your own. Look throughout history and try to find anywhere in history before Jesus where this concept and this idea was applauded and practiced. No one did it. You know why nobody did it? Because mutual submission is scary. And this is part of the reason you're going to push back on it. It's part of the reason I resist it. Mutual submission is scary. Because mutual submission requires one person in the relationship to go first. And the fear comes because I think, well, if I go first and I defer to them, what if they don't defer back to me? If I put their interest ahead of my own, what if they don't put my interest ahead of theirs? If I look out for them before me, what if nobody looks out for me? This is what keeps us from mutually submitting to one another. Because there is a fear always introduced, and the fear is, what if I don't get what I want? What if I'm not taken care of? This is why up until the time of Jesus, nobody practiced this. What they practiced instead was, let me have the power, because if I can gain the power, then I can make sure I'm protected. If I can gain the power, I can make sure no one takes advantage of me. If I have the power, then I can make sure I get what I want. And Jesus showed up and said, no, it's not about powering up, it's actually about powering down. It's not about gaining power, it's actually about laying your power down. It's about mutually submitting to one another. And what made this so powerful is Jesus didn't just show up and teach it, he modeled it. He modeled it. The Son of Man came to serve, not be served, and to give his life as a ransom for many. He showed up and he did for us what we could not do for ourselves. He put our interest ahead of his own. He treated us better than we deserved. He deferred to meet our needs. And it was so powerful, and the ultimate expression of it was on the cross. It was so powerful that when his followers saw him hanging on a cross, they never recovered from what mutual submission looked like. It wrecked them in a good way. And so after Jesus left, they began to teach this concept and this idea wherever they went. And, again, this was more powerful. They modeled it. And they practiced it, not perfectly, because they were like us, but consistently. They modeled and practiced what they had seen modeled and practiced by their Savior and their leader. And suddenly, it began to change everything. As they introduced this concept in community after community after community with people who had never seen it, never heard it, and never considered it before. It was not, up until that point, part of the culture and part of the way people related with one another. And so the Apostle Paul, he wrote about it a lot in letters that he wrote to different groups of Christians in different pockets and different places and cities. He wrote about it in a letter to Christians in Ephesus, and here's how he described it to them. He said, submit to one another. There's mutual submission. Paul said, all right, here's how I want you to treat one another. I want you to submit. I want you to surrender. I want you to defer. I want you to treat the other person, put their needs, interests, and desires above your own. Submit to one another. Paul, why should we do that? And he references back to what Jesus did ultimately on the cross. He says, well, you do it out of reverence for Christ. You don't submit to each other because that person deserves it. You don't submit to each other because you respect them so much you just want to do it. They may or may not deserve it, but you submit to one another not out of reverence or respect for them. You do it out of reverence and respect for Jesus and what he did for you. He submitted himself on your behalf when you did not deserve it. So now you should submit yourself on behalf of someone, even if they don't deserve it. And then, after explaining this, Paul begins to talk about specifically what this looks like in a Christian marriage. Okay, in a Christian marriage. He says, here's how you live this out in this kind of relationship. And he begins by addressing you ladies. He says this, wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. So just like you submit and you follow and you love God, he says, I want you to love your husband with the exact same love that you show God. I want you to submit to your husband, put the needs of your husband, the interest of your husband, the desires of your husband ahead of your own, just like you do when you follow God and you put his interest and needs, desires ahead of yours. You submit to your husband just like you do to God. Now, this verse is always dangerous to read because there have been men throughout history since the first century who have taken this. There's still men today who do it, who take it and they use it as leverage to try to force or control women to do whatever it is that they want a woman to do. I was at a wedding, this was several years ago, but I was at a wedding and there was another individual, another pastor who was officiating. And in the course of the wedding, there's a part often where a pastor will basically address and talk to the groom and the bride. And this pastor began to do it, and what I thought was odd is he talked for like 10 minutes, and the entire 10 minutes he talked directly to the bride. He didn't say a word to the groom. He talked directly to the bride for 10 minutes, and this is the only verse he read. And then he talked to her about how she should do this for 10 minutes. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in my seat next to Jen, and she is holding me down because I'm like, whoa, 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 I've got some credentials here. I'm a pastor. Let's just debate this one because you left out the first verse, submit to one another. It's like nothing about that, you know. So this happens sometimes, and I know it happens sometimes. So ladies, I want to help you out. If you ever run into a man who tries to take this verse and use it to control you or to force you to, do whatever it is he wants you to do, he's just being selfish, but uses this verse as leverage to try to do it, here's all you have to say, ladies. You look back at the man and you say, what is the first word in this verse? And he will say, wives. And you look back and say, that's right, Paul wrote it to us. Mind your own business. That's all you got to tell them. Mind your own business. Because Paul did not address this to any man. He addressed it to women. So we guys should stay out of it, okay? He has his own verse for us. He has his own direction and advice for us. And here's what he says to us guys, all right? He says, husbands, love your wives. Now, ladies, if you're going, whoa, wait a minute. He said we had to submit to our husbands, and now he's saying the husbands just have to love their wives. No, remember in the context, these two words mean the same thing because he's already said you should submit to one another. Well, what's that look like in a marriage? It means a wife loves and submits to her husband just like she loves and submits to God. And it means a husband loves and submits to his wife just like he loves and submits to God. It is mutual submission. The only difference is, in some ways, Paul raises the bar for us guys even higher. Because he says we should love our wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So he looks at all of us guys and he says, you know the kind of selfless, sacrificial love that Jesus demonstrated for us, right? He literally did not come to be served, but to serve, and then gave himself as a ransom for many. Okay. Now, guys, this is how you're supposed to love your wife. This is how you're supposed to submit to your wife. This is how you're supposed to respect and revere your wife. You demonstrate the same kind of selfless, sacrificial love that Jesus has demonstrated to you. Yeah, but she doesn't deserve. No, you didn't deserve it when Jesus did it for you either. So men, you do that for your wives. And ladies, you do that for your husbands. And this is what mutual submission looks like in a relationship. Two people who are in a submission competition. Two people who are trying to defer, out-love, out-surrender, out-submit, out-serve one another. And you do it because of the example that Jesus has set for you. You want to stay in love, happy together forever. You learn the art of mutual submission. You don't do it by powering up, you actually do it by powering down. You don't do it by demanding, you do it by deferring. You don't do it by stubbornly standing on your position, you do it by serving and submitting for the sake of the other person. Now, this next part's just my opinion, okay? So if you disagree, that's fine. I don't think it's possible for two people in a relationship to be able to consistently practice mutual submission with one another if they don't both know how to submit to God. In other words, in order for this to work in a relationship, I think it takes two people who have learned and understood how to submit themselves and live under the authority of God. And what I mean by that is this. When you have two people in a relationship who both practice, I'm going to follow God and His plan and purpose for my life, and even if it's not what I want, and even if I'm not sure how it's going to turn out, and even if it's not what I would plan or what I would choose to do, I'm just going to do whatever God asks me to do, and I'm going to trust Him. When two people have learned to live under God's authority in that way, to submit to God, if you will, then they have developed the ability to then turn towards one another and do the same thing with each other. But if you've never learned how to do that with God, I think it's next to impossible to consistently do that with one another. Now, I am not saying that only Christians can do this. And the reason I'm not saying that is because there are a lot of Christians who have never learned how to live under God's authority. There are a lot of us who call ourselves Christians, but really we have a relationship with God just for how it benefits us. We're consumers. And we would never call ourselves this, and we wouldn't want to admit this, but the reality is I only do what God asks me to do if it's in my best interest from my point of view. I'm only going to do what God asks me to do, and it makes sense to me, and I think it's going to get me where I want to go. And if He asks me to do something that doesn't make sense to me, or I feel like it's going to cost too much, I just don't do it. Well, that's not submitting and living under the authority of God. There's a term that Jesus often used that we don't use much anymore, but He used the term disciple. And He separated people who were consider themselves Christians from people who were disciples. A disciple is somebody who has gotten to the point where they were willing to surrender and trust God and do whatever He asked them to do, even if they're not sure how it's going to turn out, even if it's going to cost them something. They're going to live under His authority because He deserves their trust. And when you find two people who live that way, who don't just call themselves Christians, anybody can do that. When you find two people who live that way, under God's authority, then you have found two people who have the skills and the ability to then turn towards one another and defer repeatedly, consistently towards one another, putting the interest of the other person before their own. Now, you know why that is so rare? I don't have to tell you this, you know. That is so rare because this kind of mutual submission costs something, doesn't it? It requires massive doses of humility. And none of us want to demonstrate humility. None of us are hardwired for humility. We are hardwired for self-preservation. I'm hardwired and you're hardwired in any situation to look out for myself first. And you look out for yourself first. And once everything's taken care of with me and I've got everything I want, then I'll focus on you. But I'm not going to put your interest ahead of my own until all of mine are met. The problem is your needs and my needs are never ever fully met, are they? There's always something else we wish we'd have, so we never put other people before us on a consistent basis. Because we're hardwired for self-preservation. We're hardwired for selfishness. And what Paul's getting at is if you're going to stay in love, happy together forever, you have to learn humility. And the better you practice humility, the better you can practice mutual submission. So the question becomes, how do you get better at humility? Have you ever had somebody say, well, how do you know if you're a humble person? Well, once you admit it, then you're not really humble. So how do you even figure that out, Well, James, the brother of Jesus, actually wrote us some instruction on how to grow in humility. Now, just the fact that James, the brother of Jesus, wrote down his thoughts and we still have them 2,000 years later, that's just fascinating to me. But he addressed this, and he probably more than anybody knew what this looked like because he grew up with Jesus. Can you imagine how hard and how annoying that would have been? It's like Mary's going, hey, be more humble. I'm trying. No, not like your brother. It's like you could never measure up. So James is here, and he had a front row seat to what humility looked like, to what submission looked like, surrender looked like. And then years later, he didn't believe Jesus was the Messiah until after his resurrection. But years later, once he finally comes to believe and sees Jesus, alive after he had died, then he's writing this letter and he's helping them to understand some of the things he learned from his own brother. And here's what he says to them and to us about how to develop humility. He starts with a question. He says, who is wise and understanding among you? Now, he's setting us up. This is not one of those questions you want to raise your hand to, is it? Because you immediately disqualify yourself. You're not wise and understanding if you think you are. So this is one of those questions he's just setting us up. He's wanting to drive home the point. People who are wise and understanding, you don't discover that by what they say. You discover it by something you would expect. You discover it by what they do. He goes on and he says, well, if you're wise and understanding, then let them show it by their good life, by their actions, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. You know what wisdom is? Wisdom is simply the ability to see that all of life is connected. That's wisdom. A person who is wise understands that what I did yesterday is having an impact on today. And whatever I do today is going to have an impact on tomorrow. That the choices, decisions, words I speak, all of the things, my actions today are not contained in today. They travel with me into the future. A wise person realizes, they see the bigger picture. They realize that all of life is connected. They have a much broader perspective. I like to say it this way, that wisdom is seeing life from God's point of view. Because if you see life from God's point of view, you see the full spectrum. You see how everything is connected. Now, here's what James is saying. This is interesting. James is saying that when you begin to see that all of life is connected, that you develop humility. And when you have humility, it's a cycle. As you develop humility, guess what you gain? More wisdom. And the more wisdom you gain, then the more humility you gain, which leads to more wisdom and more humility, and on the cycle goes. Now, I don't have to tell you this. That cycle does not represent most of the relationships we see in life today. It may not even represent the relationships you have. If somebody were describing it, or if you were describing it, you might not describe it as, hey, this is a relationship marked by a lot of humility and wisdom from both of us. Because this isn't natural. Here's what's natural. James goes on. He says, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. This is James' way of saying, you can spot if someone lacks humility. And the way you spot it is they tip their hand by what they brag about and what they deny. Just listen to somebody. James is saying, you can spot it. They'll tip their hand. Because people who lack humility will always circle back to talking about themselves. They'll always circle back to patting themselves on the back. They'll always circle back to boasting about their achievements. And people who lack humility will always deny the truth. People who lack humility do not have the ability to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, that was my fault, period. Now, they'll say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, that was my fault, but, and then they'll go on, we've all had these conversations, haven't we, where it's like 5 minutes of excuses afterwards, and by the end of it, you're going, I don't really think you think this was on you. You just blame me after you said you were sorry. That's not humility. That's somebody who denies the truth. James says, no. You'll see somebody who has humility because they're able to own their mistakes, their mess-ups, their failures, and just say, this is on me. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I own it. Period. But when you can't do that, you find yourself in another cycle. The cycle that James just wrote about. A cycle of bitter envy, which leads to selfish ambition, which creates more bitter envy, which leads to more selfish ambition. You know why that happens? Because when you lack humility, you will end up being insecure in life. And when you're insecure, then you will be envious of what other people have. You say, wait a minute, Matt. People who are insecure don't have a humility problem. Yes, they do. Here's why. You have insecurity because you're not humble enough to acknowledge the fact that you don't have it all together. You have insecurity because you're not humble enough to admit, I'm not good at that, I messed that up, I'm still trying to figure that out. You have insecurity because you're not humble enough to admit there's still things you need to learn. And you're not okay in every area of your life. See, the person who is humble enough to admit, I don't have it all together, actually experiences security. They don't have insecurity because they're okay not having it all together. They're trying to get it all together, but they're okay admitting they don't have it all together, and they're okay with you knowing they don't have it all together. The insecure person isn't humble enough to let you know they don't have it all together, so they try to act like they do. And then they feel insecure, which leads to envy because they see you having it together in an area they don't have it, and they wish they had it, and suddenly they're envious and jealous of you. And what happens when you see somebody who has something that you don't have and it makes you feel inferior? Then you have so much selfish ambition in you, you do everything you can to try to get what they have and get a little bit more of it. So you go from envy to selfish ambition. And that pursuit of more, I've got to be better than them, I've got to top them, I've got to do it a little, further or faster than they do it. That selfish ambition just creates more envy when you find somebody else who's a little further ahead, which creates more selfish ambition, and it's a cycle that wrecks relationships. So this is James' point. He says, in your relationship, you can live in 1-2 cycles. Humility, which leads to wisdom, which leads to more humility and more wisdom, and on, or envy, which leads to ambition, which leads to envy and ambition, and on and on and on. It goes. And I don't have to convince you. You're smart enough to know which one will help you stay in love, happy together forever, and which one won't. But James wanted to give us a clear description of what the two look like. James believed, remember, love isn't a noun, it's a verb. James believed you get to choose whether you're going to be humble or not. You get to choose which wisdom you're going to follow. And so he lays out the choice for us. Here's what he says. Such wisdom, he puts it in quotes because it's not real wisdom to just live with envy and selfish ambition over and over again. He says, such wisdom doesn't come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. That's such strong language. But the reason James uses strong language is because of the strong impact and the wreckage this will create if you keep living this way. This will ruin your relationships. He says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Well, that just explains some of our relationships, didn't it? It's like, how did he know? Well, he knew because it's predictable. It's predictable. But there's another option. There's another choice. He says, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, which was his way of saying, the wisdom that you experience when you choose to live under God's authority and submit to him. God, I'm going to follow your plan. God, I'm going to do things your way. God, it doesn't make sense, and I'm not sure if it's going to turn out great for me and it's going to cost me, but I'm going to trust you and obey you anyway. When you live that way, you discover and you gain a different kind of wisdom. The wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure. It's selfless. Now, imagine if two people are in a relationship and they're demonstrating a selfless, pure love towards one another on a consistent basis. What are the odds they're going to stay in love, happy together forever? He says not only that, it's peace-loving. Imagine if two people in a relationship said, you know what? I'm going to fight, but I'm not going to fight to be right. And I'm not going to fight to get my way. And I'm not going to fight for my wishes and wants and desires. No. Two people in a relationship, imagine if they both went, we're going to fight, but we're going to fight for peace. That's what we're fighting for. We're going to fight for this relationship more than anything else. Doesn't matter if I'm right or not right. It doesn't matter if you admit that I'm right or not right. We're fighting for peace here. Imagine if two people did that consistently. He says it's considerate. Imagine if two people in a relationship consistently went, I'm going to consider your needs before my own. I'm going to consider your perspective before my own. Here's our word. It's submissive. Two people treating each other as if they were the most important person in the room every single day. It's full of mercy and good fruit. This was James' way of saying, imagine if two people, when one of them messed up, because none of us are perfect, so we don't always get it right, but imagine if every time one of them messed up, the other one responded not with judgment, not with anger, not with harshness. Imagine if they responded with mercy, with grace, with love. That wouldn't push them away. That would draw them closer. Conflict would be a tunnel to a deeper connection. He says it's impartial. It's sincere. I genuinely want what's best for you more than I want what's best for me. So this was James' way of saying, well, you got a couple options here. You can do relationships your way, which means whenever you're afraid you're not going to get what you want or you're not going to be taken care of, what you're going to do is you're going to put up your walls and you're going to guard and protect and defend and fight. Guard and protect and defend and fight and argue and do whatever you can to take care of you first. You can do it that way. But it's never going to lead to you staying in love, happy together forever. Or you can try it God's way. You can choose a different kind of wisdom. You can choose to defer rather than demand. You can choose to serve them rather than stubbornly stand. You can choose to admit when you're wrong and not flaunt it when you're right. You can choose mutual submission. I am going to treat them as if they are the most important person in the room. See, this is the beauty of this. You know how to submit to someone. You know what this looks like because you have done it before. Whoever that person is that you would give anything to be in a room with for 10 minutes, whoever that person is you look up to, if you could have a dinner with them, it'd be so amazing. Imagine that you got to sit down and have dinner with them. This would suddenly be so easy for you. You would submit to them. You would defer to them, and you wouldn't think twice about it. Because to you, they would be the most important person in the room. So you wouldn't cut them off when they were telling a story. You wouldn't correct them when they said something wrong. You wouldn't chastise them because they were 10 minutes late. You wouldn't argue with them. No. You would just defer to them, whatever they want. Well, James and Paul are simply saying, this is what it should look like in any marriage relationship. A husband and a wife, each treating the other person as if they are the most important person in the room. And when two people can learn to do that consistently, they've just discovered what it takes to stay in love, happy together forever. But it's not easy, and it's not easy because it requires a payment of massive doses of humility. And yet here's the irony of it all. As much as we resist and fight against humility, when we demonstrate humility, it attracts, doesn't it? When you find yourself in a relationship with somebody who is demonstrating humility towards you, you are drawn closer to them. You are not pushed away from them. We are always attracted to humility. Humility will solve most of the conflict that two people have. So, with that being said, I want to give you the one thing, okay? Here's the one thing I want to encourage you to do, and it's the one thing that you're going to push back on and you're going to resist doing this week. And I know that because it happens to me, it happens to everybody I ever talk to about this. And you're going to push back on it and resist it because it's going to require humility. It's 4 simple words. It's one simple question that I want to encourage you to ask. How can I help? That's it. How can I help? Now here's what I mean by this. You're in an argument. You're in a fight. They don't see it your way. You don't see it their way. Instead of fighting to be right, hit pause and look at them and say, I know we don't see eye to eye on this. That's okay. How can I help? How can I help you? How can I help see this the way you see it? I don't even have to be right here. We don't have to go my way. We'll go your way. Just tell me how I can help. When you see them overwhelmed, when you see them stressed, you show up and you go, hey, seems like you're a little stressed. You tell me, how can I help? How can I help? When they've got so much on their plate, you show up and they're so busy trying to get everything, you just show up and say, hey, simple question, how can I help? You tell me what to do and I'll do it. How can I help? I am deferring to you. I'm putting you ahead of me. And I'll do whatever you want me to do. Now, you do not assume how you can help and go do it. I can tell you from personal experience, that doesn't end well, usually. Because what I assume she needs is very rarely what she actually needs. So I can go do all kinds of things that she needs, and then at the end she's upset. Why did you spend all your time doing that? And I'm like, I'm trying to help. She's like, that's no help at all. So do not assume. You actually have to ask the question. And even if what they say you can do to help doesn't seem very helpful, you do it anyway. Because that's what will help them from their point of view. And remember, it's about them. You're deferring to them. It's not about you. So you ask the question, how can I help? Now, let me tell you why you're going to resist this. Because you're going to find yourself in situations this week where this pops in your mind, and just as you're ready to say it, you're going to think to yourself, but I don't want to help right now. I just want my way. But I don't want to ask that question because they may ask me to do something I don't want to do. But I don't want to ask that question because I think I'm right, and I want them to see I'm right and they're wrong. Whenever you feel that resistance inside of you, whenever you don't want to ask this question, you can pause and go, right there's pride. Right there's selfish ambition in me. This is not the way of humility. Humility says, how can I help? I'm here for you. You tell me what to do and I'll do it. Whether it makes sense to me or not. Whether I want to do it or not. Whether I'm excited about doing it or not. How can I help? I'm here to do it. How can I help? Says to the other person, I am here for your benefit, not for mine. And when you find a relationship where two people develop this habit and the humility to be able to look at one another and go, how can I help? How can I help? They have developed the ability to practice mutual submission, and it is the most powerful relationship principle on the planet. Once you learn to mutually submit to one another, guess what you'll naturally grow in? You'll learn to grow in patience. Your love will be more patient. Your love will be more kind. Your love will be more honoring. It'll be more humble. Your love will not keep a record of wrongs. Your love will assume the best, not the worst. And it starts with this simple cheat code, this simple question of consistently asking and acting on, how can I help you? Now, for those of you who maybe you're like me, and we're 3 weeks into this series and you're going, okay, Matt, this is great. The problem with this whole series is everything has been about what I need to change and nothing has been about them. When are we going to talk about them? Because I think they play a role in the problems we have. I get that. So next week we're going to talk about them, okay? Next week we're going to talk about what's going on inside of them that causes them to keep doing over and over the thing that's driving you crazy. But I'll just warn you, it's also the thing inside of you that keeps you doing the thing over and over again that drives them crazy. But if you don't identify and deal with the thing inside of you, you'll never get to the point to be able to mutually submit to one another. You got to recognize it for what it is and address it. So we'll talk about that next week. This week, will you just start practicing the question? With a spouse, with a fiance, with a boyfriend, girlfriend, you can use this anywhere, with a coworker, with a classmate, with a neighbor, with a roommate, whoever. Would you just start asking the question, how can I help? I'm not going to argue. How can I help? I'm not going to debate. How can I help? I'm not going to leave and just go do what I want to do. How can I help? Unless they tell you, you can help by leaving, and then you won and they won, okay? So everybody's out. But you're going to ask the question first. How can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And then with humility, you're going to defer to them above yourself. The wisdom that comes from above puts you on the path to staying in love. But you've got to be humble enough to ask the question and to submit. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you for showing up on this planet and showing us what this looked like, because we were the last people to deserve it. We had done nothing to earn it. And yet, Jesus, here you were. You came in human form and you submitted to us and you served us. And ultimately, you gave your life on a cross for our sins when we were completely helpless and completely undeserving. So thanks for showing us what it looks like when we had no idea. And now we need your power and your strength and your help and your courage to have enough humility to do it ourselves. To do it when we feel like doing it, but more importantly, to do it when we don't feel like doing it, to do it when we don't feel like they deserve it, because it's not about that. So help us to choose humility, which leads to wisdom, which will give us more humility and more wisdom. And when two people in a relationship do that, and we learn to mutually submit to one another, it really does change everything in the relationship forever. It really is the secret to staying in love, happy together forever. So help us to choose the wisdom that's from above. And when we get it wrong, help us to own it and then choose it the next time, until you're able to shape our character to be the kind of character that is marked by humility. The strength of humility and the strength of wisdom that comes from it. That's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.